Get ready for the greatest roast of all time, the Roast of Tom Brady, a Netflix live event happening May 5th. Hosted by Kevin Hart, the 7-time world champion gets his cleats held to the fire by famous friends and frenemies on an unforgettable night where everything is fair game. Tune in on May 5th at 5 p.m. Pacific time for the Roast of Tom Brady, live only on Netflix.
You ready?
Showtime.
On May 3rd, summer starts with The Fall Guy.
Let's do it later.
Let's drink a spicy margarita.
Make some bad decisions.
Yes!
Audiences are falling in love with the most entertaining film of the year.
Fall Guy.
Fall Guy?
Fall guy.
That's what the poster said.
See Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt in the movie critics say exists to make you happy.
Trying to make it out?
Nope.
Because I don't either. It's not what I'm into right now.
What are you into?
Talking.
Yeah.
The Fall Guy. Only in theaters May 3rd. Rated PG-13.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim, and we are starting our series, or really just the new direction of this podcast, which is really just to talk about the state of each program. I'm really excited as we get started. I talked to several podcasters. We're going to get Iowa and Nebraska, Ohio State, and Minnesota are all lined up for the next several weeks. But before we get to those programs, we want to talk about the conference. And you guys know my good buddy JR. He's the host of the Big Ten Huddle over at the College Huddle Network. I am his Robin to his Batman. But JR, why don't you say hi and just share a little bit about the pod and the network that you've started?
Hey, Zach. Yeah, glad to be here. It's kind of weird reverse roles in this situation because I'm normally the one leaning in on the Big Ten Huddle, but you do a great job as well, so I can't complain. The College Huddle, we are the largest fan-made podcast network out there. We have over 70 different podcasts. If you have a favorite team in the Big Ten, chances are we have you. I think there's only 3 teams right now. I think Michigan, USC, and one more. I forget who the last one is. I apologize. But we're looking for podcasts for them. But like I said, we have podcasts from every conference. We have a show for all Power 4 conferences. And then we have a Group of 5 show that covers all different kinds of Group of 5 teams and stuff like that. So check us out on YouTube, College Huddle. And you'll see Zach over there as well on Tuesdays at 9 o'clock Eastern time with me. So if you want to catch a live show of us together, go on over there and check us out.
Yeah, and if there's an abrupt ending to this episode, it's because we're recording this right before the live show. So we apologize if there's an abrupt ending.
Gotta make it on time, right?
Yeah, yeah. Unlike this one, that one's live. This one is pre-recorded. So I wanted to get JR in here because I think one of the things I'm a historian of sorts, and I think it's neat to think about where the Big Ten has been and where it is now. And so we're shifting the philosophy or the focus of this podcast to really be the state of programs. But the reality is the Big Ten, I think we would both agree, has positioned itself as one of the 2 premier conferences in college football. But that really hasn't been the perception for decades, really. And so I wanted to start with a pseudo question and get your take on it. I think it was November 18th, 2006. It was the game of the century. Number 1, Ohio State. Number 2, Michigan. Classic game. People were talking about how Michigan lost and still could make the national championship game. And it seemed like the Big Ten stock couldn't get any higher. And then the Rose Bowl happened, and you're like, oh, Michigan just got exposed a little bit. But that's okay. Like, Ohio State's still playing the national championship game, and then Ohio State got pantsed. Like, legit, like, Ted Ginn goes down, and you're like, oh, this is not good. Like, Urban Meyer just destroyed somebody. And it seemed like from 2006 to really, honestly, maybe 2015, 2016, you really had the Big Ten reputation in the tank. And even when the Big Ten started to climb a bit, it never really felt like they got their due. Maybe, JR, talk about what the perception has been really over the past 20 years in the Big Ten?
Yeah, it's been up and down. I think that back in the early years in the 2000s and things like that, you had a Big Ten with a better reputation. Honestly, I feel like the perception of the Big Ten began to take a drop when recruiting rankings became such big deals. Now, Michigan has shown in the past few years, that you can be a top level team without recruiting at the top 5, top 10. I can't remember. I think they had a top 10 class back in 19 or 20, but I don't think they've had one since 2021, and showing that, you can run a program with development and not just recruiting rankings. And so that was huge for the Big Ten, because now you're starting to see programs like Iowa and other programs that have been able to produce NFL talent. Other ones like Minnesota comes to mind with some of their NFL talent that they've been able to produce. Penn State, although they are a better recruiting school than most, they are also able to produce a lot of NFL talent. And there's other schools out there. I'm not trying to skip anybody, but kind of showing that you are able to produce NFL talent and produce good college football players, even if you don't have the highest recruiting rankings in the world, because at the end of the day, that's what many people in college athletics, college sports, college football look to when they're trying to determine who is going to be the best this year. Now we kind of have a shift with the transfer portal as well, right? You see these teams having high transfer portal rankings, and sometimes you think they're a little bit flawed. Colorado comes to mind with how they get a lot of transfer portal players, but their recruiting rankings aren't always the best, so you think they kind of balance out and they kind of meet in the middle somewhere. But at the end of the day, Big Ten teams are now taking advantage of the transfer portal in a new way, and so I think we're going to see the Big Ten, not just with the addition of Oregon and USC, you're going to see the perception of the Big Ten grow again. Purdue has gone out and gotten players from Georgia and Texas, programs that are playoff level programs, and they've brought them in, and although they haven't been able to be a playoff level program yet, obviously they were 4-8 last year, or 3-9, one of those. They weren't able 4-8.
Yeah.
Trust
your instincts, JR.
Yeah. They are able to gain some better players, which I think will, produce for them at some point. We've also seen Minnesota grab players from Clemson and from Georgia. Iowa almost grabbed Caden Proctor. Sorry, Iowa fans. They almost grabbed an Alabama player. So you're seeing these schools in the Big Ten who aren't known for their recruiting being able to get some really good players that they can bring in, that maybe they weren't the best player on Georgia, maybe they weren't starting, but for a program like Purdue, that could be a star player, or a program like Minnesota, that could be a star player and really make an impact for them. And so I think it's going to be interesting as we continue to go, because like I said, recruiting rankings, as they started to come into effect, that's when you started to see the perception of the Big Ten decline, because there is so much more, which if you look at the politics of recruiting rankings, and I'm not trying to get into it here, but most of them are produced down in the South, because you can play football year round down in the South. I don't think I'm kidding anybody when I tell a Minnesota fan you can't play football year round up in Minnesota, right? There's a reason why hockey is a big thing in Minnesota and in Michigan and some of these other Big Ten schools, and why baseball is not a big thing for a lot of Big Ten fans, because you just don't have the ability to play year round like some of these Southern schools do. Well, similar things happen in football, where you are able to get eyes on different recruits at different times. I was just listening to a recruiting podcast before we came in here. Tavian St. Clair is the number 6 player in the 2026 class, or 2025 class, and he is the number 2 quarterback. Andrew Ivins for 24/7 just saw Tavian St. Clair for the first time. The head scouting director for 24/7, he's the number 6 player in the class, and he just saw Tavian St. Clair for the first time this weekend at Elite 11. So you don't see the kind of notoriety for some of these players, because they aren't down in the South. And I think, fortunately, with the transfer portal and these guys getting into playing in programs, or at least getting to programs with higher recruiting rankings and moving on to possibly a Big Ten program, you're going to see a better perception of the conference once they start producing.
Yeah, and I think with that, the Big Ten for a while hadn't produced a first-round quarterback. I think, was it Dwayne Haskins was the first quarterback since Kerry Collins, maybe, in the first round?
Sounds
There's some
right.
sort, like, it was a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was I think a 24-year gap, which is crazy. But then I think also, like, they're recruiting better on the lines, on the offensive line, defensive line. You go back to that 2006 national championship game, the tackles in that game were turnstiles for Derek Harvey. And I think that was the thing, is everybody kept talking about SEC speed, but it really wasn't speed everywhere. Like, no one was going to say that everybody was out racing Ted Ginn or, guys like that. What was his name? The Purdue guy that was super fast.
Rondale Moore.
Rondale Moore. Like, they had specific guys who were really fast, but it was really the speed in the trenches that really made the difference, and the quarterback play. And
the
so I think
as well in the trenches.
Yeah, that's a great point.
One of the biggest things that LSU and Florida had on Ohio State when they made it to the national championship in the late 2000s is they had the depth to be able to battle with a lot of Ohio State's guys.
Yeah. Well, and then you had this, like, I remember Penn State playing Alabama in the non-conference and Bama just smoking Penn State. And you're like, Penn State's a good team, but they look so average. And I think that was, those spotlight games are what really killed the perception. But I think you're right. I think recruiting was a big factor. I'm curious to get your take on this, because I would have thought the way they were perceived and the way recruiting was in that time period, that the Big Ten would really shrivel. But it seemed like, despite all of the negative press and all the negative recruiting, somehow the Big Ten was able to not only survive, but really build. What do you attribute that to? And I know recruiting's part of it, but what do you attribute to them being able to stay stable in the midst of that lull?
Well, Big Ten programs, they have a good amount of tradition. They have a good amount of pride in what they do. And so, honestly, what it comes down to is, for a lot of Big Ten teams, they were able to stay relevant because of their fan bases, which I know some people are going to say, well, that doesn't really matter on the field. And I get that, but let's think back to why the Big Ten was able to sign their deal with NBC and CBS and Fox. It's because the Big Ten, not only do they have large fan bases who are impactful for their teams, but also they did a good job of aligning schools in large areas. You think of a team like Rutgers. You don't think of a very, I'm not trying to be mean here, Rutgers fans, but I think even they would recognize, you don't think of a great football team when you think of Rutgers, right? But what you do think of is the location and their proximity to New York and some of the things that they're able to do there. And then you think of Maryland. You think of another team that's out there on the Atlantic coast, that's on a state that is bordering the Atlantic coast, has a little bit of that D.C. kind of area, stuff like that there. And so you have made this, even though the football wasn't as good as the SEC and sometimes was worse than maybe the Pac-12, you have made this a conference that has fan bases who want to watch. And at the end of the day, who cares about, how good the football is if you have people watching? And that's what the TV companies cared about. And now, because of the TV companies, because of their involvement, you have more funding to be able to have larger athletic departments, not just for football, but also basketball, Olympic sports, women's sports, all different kinds of, women's basketball, all different kinds of things that you're able to put that money into. And the universities can still have pride and still have great tradition within their schools.
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate, people don't realize how important getting Rutgers and Maryland was, because especially the way TV deals worked, you're getting these markets that drive up revenue, which I think that also brings into play the Big Ten Network and having the Big Ten Network and how that really added, they were really the first conference to really do their own TV stuff. There were teams that had, obviously Notre Dame comes to mind, like they had their own TV contract, but they're at a very
Texas
different
as well.
Texas, yeah, the Longhorn Network. But there was no conference that was doing it. And ironically, the first game that the Big Ten Network aired was Appalachian State beating Michigan. And so you're like, oh, this is a faceplant for the conference. But what people don't realize is that Jim Delaney, who I think is as much as he was a traditionalist, he really thought long-term big picture and realizing the lifeblood of our conference is going to be secured not necessarily by championships, but by revenue. And so we thought, how do we secure revenue? And it wasn't just from a athletic perspective, it was from an academic perspective too. And so at least up until recently, every school was an AAU school. But then in terms of expansion, it was very strategic. It wasn't just who's best. It was who is going to drive up revenue and TV market share. And it was a really brilliant strategy. And so I really agree. Like, I think people don't see, like Nebraska, I love Nebraska. They fit so well in terms of the demographic of what the Big Ten was. Rutgers and Maryland didn't. And I think people were like, why are we taking them? And I think you hit the nail on the head. Like New York, Baltimore, DC. That's why. So.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that's the thing that, I've been studying probably the past 2 years with this conference realignment is, why does it matter adding a team like Rutgers? Rutgers has very little, football history. And what it actually does is it does make me scared for certain teams like Indiana or Purdue, who neither of them have, the largest fan bases in the world for football, but they both have, very passionate basketball fan bases. Well, you might be able to say one of those teams is good for the conference. However, two in the same state, is that really going to be viable? Now, this is not me saying that, Indiana or Purdue, this is just an example of two teams that are in the same state. And this is not me saying that either of them are going to be kicked out of the Big Ten. I don't think that will happen. But I do think that there will be thought processes of what teams are making us the most money, and do we want to bring in two teams from the same state? Again, that's when you start thinking about teams like Florida State and Miami. It's been rumored for a long time that both those schools would come in together, but obviously Indiana and Purdue are going to be a focal point in trying to figure out, would bringing in Florida State and Miami work together, would bring them in together, work well for the conference, or are we finding ourselves in another situation where we have two teams from the same state? Now, obviously, Florida's a little bit different, much higher population state, one that you would be able to, work with a little bit more. Both are in larger areas, Tallahassee, Miami. It's not West Lafayette and Bloomington. Nothing against those places. Those are just more college towns. They're not large cities. But I think you catch my drift.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good segue to where I want to go in this conversation. And maybe we'll kind of wrap this up with this question is, obviously with conference realignment, the Big Ten has really positioned themselves as really a whole country conference, really with the exception of the South. And from a competitive advantage or a competitive view, you just had a current Big Ten team and a future Big Ten team in the national championship game. And Michigan, the traditional power, won the national championship. And so obviously from a financial perspective, a competitive perspective, the Big Ten looks maybe as complete as they ever have. Where do you see us going from here?
in terms of realignment or
just like what's the trajectory of the conference? And where are we now, and where do you see us going?
I think the conference wants to essentially work with the SEC and create a new brand of college football is what I think. Now, I know this is not something that's popular, and so I don't always vocalize it because typically you get people mad from the Big 12 and the ACC. But at the end of the day, if you look at the trajectory of both the Big 10 and the SEC, they're heading in the same direction. Both of them want to add schools that help increase their bottom line, and both of them want to be known as the conference that makes the most money, so that the way they're able to distribute that money out to their schools, which once you have money in the schools, then you have better coaches, better facilities, all those things that would then give you a better product on the field. And I think that is somewhere that the Big Ten is aiming for, not just in football, but in other sports as well. I think that's the difference, though, between the Big Ten and the SEC is I think the SEC has 2 or 3 sports in football, basketball, both men's and women's, so I guess 4 sports, and baseball that they really want to lift up there. When in reality, the Big Ten, not only do they want to be good in football and basketball, but I think they value those Olympic sports more than other schools or other conferences do. And so at the end of the day, you're looking at how can we make the most money for these schools, and it just so happens that football is the greatest moneymaker for these schools. And so at the end of the day, whatever they can do to help increase their bottom line, give them more, whether that's pushing somebody back down, it is what it is. I think the Big Ten and the SEC are both willing to do that.
Yeah. And how, in your mind, how does the playoff kind of, and the way that the Big Ten has realigned, like how does that help revenue in your mind?
Well, I think the playoffs, obviously, you have more teams in there, you make more money. If so facto, then you have more for everybody else. And at the end of the day, I think that the Big Ten adding teams that do focus so much on football, it allows for their other teams that maybe don't focus as much on it to continue producing Olympic level, basketball level, schools. That's one of the reasons why you see Indiana and Purdue, at least in my mind, this is my opinion. That's one of the reasons why you see schools like Indiana and Purdue not increasing their football budget nearly as much as some other ones have, is because I think the Big Ten truly is okay with saying, hey, Ohio State, Michigan, and Oregon and USC are football powers. And then Indiana, Purdue, Michigan State, Maryland, whoever else are basketball powers. Didn't try to leave anybody out there. So if I did,
don't tell that to Kurt Signetti.
Yeah, he wouldn't like that at all, would he? He's coming for Ohio State and Michigan and all those other football powers. But at the end of the day, I just think that the Big Ten is willing to say it's okay if our football powers are known for football, our basketball powers are known for basketball, and this is the conference that we've created. Because what are you judged by? Are you judged by how good the conference is overall? No. The Big Ten has had historically the deepest conference in basketball for a long time. For a good amount of time, football, you could argue, was the deepest conference. But nobody cares about that. People care about national championships. People care about Final Fours. People care about playoff appearances. They don't care about, how was your 9th best team in the conference. And so at the end of the day, I think that the Big Ten is realizing if we can get 4 or 5 powers in each conference that's consistently competing for Big Ten titles and for national championships, that's what we need, and eventually we will get there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you remember, that was the big selling point for the SEC for so long, because it wasn't just Alabama who won titles. It was Florida, it was LSU, Georgia, Auburn, or maybe we should just say Cam Newton. But there were so many schools that were not just good, but they were national championship teams over 18-year stretch. And so I really appreciate that thought. You now have a lineup in the Big Ten where you have Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, USC, Washington, Oregon, all those schools can get into the playoff and do some damage. And I think even Michigan State and Wisconsin, when they've been good, like they've competed with some of the tough, the top-notch teams. Like I think of 2013 Michigan State, and like they were a really good football team that took down Stanford in that Rose Bowl. So like they can get to those heights. It certainly takes more for them to do it, and that really does. If you get deeper into the playoff and you win national championships, that really helps, and it gets the opposing TV networks, which I will not name, but you all know who I'm talking about, kind of off the back. It's felt like for years it was like, well, the Big Ten's not very good, they're slow, but that perception has changed almost across the board. And I think, and I'll end with this, I think something you said that I want to point out too, the Big Ten has positioned themselves where they're no longer perceived as an inferior conference. They've positioned themselves where they're in a sense the hunter, but also they are a predominant conference, and they are competing with the SEC for really who is the best conference. And it's really just those two. And the reason why is not because of competitive nature, but it's because of the financial piece. And that has allowed them to then become more competitive. So let me just, I feel like we've had good discussion here. Any last thoughts on this, on kind of the just overall state of the Big Ten?
I just think the conference is moving in the right direction. I think you have a conference that is going to remain on top in basketball. I think you have a conference that is trending in the right direction to stay involved for national championships in football. And at the end of the day, I truly believe that every school is important to what the Big Ten is doing. That's why I don't necessarily go after the Rutgers of the world, or the UCLA, or all these different schools, and say like, oh, why are they in the conference? Like some other people do, because every single school adds value in some kind of way to our conference, and that is really what you want. And it's been that way with the Big Ten for a long time. Like I said, the Big Ten has historically been a very deep conference in a lot of sports, because they have aimed for every school to add value in some way, shape, or form. And to me, I just appreciate every single school adding that value, because when we do boost the conference up, we boost up our teams as well. The Big Ten, my goal for the Big Ten, and obviously I'm not making this happen, but I hope it does happen at some point, is for a Big Ten Big Ten championship to mean nearly as much as a national championship, whether that be basketball, whether that be football, whether that be Olympic sports, baseball, whatever it is. I want a Big Ten championship to mean almost as much as a national championship, similar to how the SEC has had that in baseball, how the SEC has had that in football, how the Big East will sometimes have that in basketball, the Big 12 sometimes will have that in basketball, where if you win the conference, you're the favorite to win it all, because that's the best conference. Yeah.
Well, and I think we might get that this year, because I think there's
Maybe.
a few teams in the Big Ten that, I mean, I think a lot of people are looking at Ohio State and Oregon, but, we talked with the guys from Maize and Blue, the Maize and Blue podcast, or Out of the Blue podcast. I mean, Michigan's not going to be a slouch again this year. Penn State's not going to be a slouch this year. We don't know what to expect from USC. They could bounce back in a big way. And then you've got the Fighting Fickles of Wisconsin. I mean, there's a lot of depth. And I would argue that it's not just depth, but there's a lot of top-end talent too. Urban Meyer, mentioned on the Ohio State spring game that might be the most talented team he's seen in I think he said 6 or 7 years, which, like, Urban might be blowing smoke a little bit, but to put that out there as an analyst, that's saying something. And they do have a lot of talent. And I think that they're not the only ones that have a lot of talent in the conference. So I think we might see that even this year. So, JR, why don't you tell people where they can find you? Or find us, I should say.
Yeah. College Huddle. Yeah, for the College Huddle podcast on YouTube, College Huddle pretty much everywhere else. We're predominantly on Twitter, so head on over there. Not tweeting out mainly Big Ten stuff right now. Still trying to find our voice a little bit on Twitter, but that is the spot where we are the most active. The place that I am personally the most active is JR's_rankings. So if you like the occasional Big Ten content and Ohio State content and the occasional bickering with Michigan fans, you can find me over there. I try to always be respectful. So if you try to get into a bickering match with me, I try to be respectful. But, I did have somebody tell me the other day I was worthless and meant nothing to the world. So I thought, well, I will block.
That, the block feature seems so like I don't want to use that. And then you meet someone who you're like, I need to use this. This makes sense. So don't be someone we want to block. Yeah. Don't do that.
I would like to block the NCAA and anybody who throws rabid insults at me.
Obligatory, the NCAA stinks. T-shirt plug.
I figured you'd be on that.
Yeah. This has been the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. Again, make sure to follow us on here, on Spotify, Google, Apple. Really, Spotify and YouTube are where I would love for you guys to mostly follow us. But Apple and Google are pretty cool too.